In 1967, a woman named Betty Andreassonand was visited by 4 extraterrestrial beings of unknown origin. These alien beings had appeared to her after a strange pink light illuminated her kitchen window. 4 beings had faced through her kitchen door, and they all looked very similar to each other. They had pear-shaped heads, big black eyes, small circles for noses, and a wrinkly mouth. All of them except for one, who was a little bit different than the others. One of them was taller than the rest of them and stood around 4 feet tall, where the others were only 3 feet tall. He came to Betty and introduced himself as Quasga, and he told her that he's here to help save the world, because the world is, quite frankly, trying to destroy itself. So the alien was able to persuade Betty into visiting this alien world. But what made Betty so special? She was just an ordinary housewife with 7 kids in a small rural town. For what reason did these aliens need Betty? Well, the answer is quite simple. They wanted her light source. But before we get into this psychedelic story about a woman visiting an alien planet, I just want to say thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you enjoy this video with my shitty little animations that took me forever to make. Now, back to the video. Betty was a simple housewife living in a rural town of South Ashburnham, Massachusetts. She was married to a man named James, and together they had a family of 7. They lived in a large farmhouse, but this farmhouse was nothing special. It was run down and needed a lot of work. The pipes were leaking, the paint was chipping, and the porch was crumbling. You could say it was a handyman special, but nevertheless, Betty and James made the most of their situation and fixed it up to raise their family. They were devout Christians and believed that the struggles in life is part of God's plan. They were happy living a quiet existence, but soon their faith would be tested. On December 23rd, 1966, 2 days before Christmas, a woman collided with the rear of James' Volkswagen, sending him into a head-on collision with incoming traffic. This left James severely injured and needed intensive care for weeks. He was on the verge of death, and it didn't look good for the Andreassonands, but Betty had hope and kept praying for James' well-being. The only problem was, it wasn't looking good for them. Each day, James kept getting worse and worse until the unexpected happened.
These creatures that I saw through the window of Betty's house were just like Halloween freaks. I thought they had put on a funny kind of headdress imitating a moon man. It was funny the way they jumped one after the other, just like grasshoppers. When they saw me looking at them, they stopped. The one in front looked at me and I felt kind of queer. That's all I knew.
Betty was relaxing at home one late June night. She was with her 7 kids and her dad. Her father, Wino Aho, had offered to help take care of the kids in James' absence. He was watching a movie with the kids until the lights went out. The house was enveloped by a deep darkness that confused everyone because it was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Wino went to investigate the strange power outage, leaving Betty and her children behind. Betty and her 7 children were patiently waiting for Aho to come back. But before that could even happen, a strange pink light illuminated the kitchen window. Betty started to panic because, let's be honest, who wouldn't be afraid of a strange pink light coming from your window? She gathered all her children and took them to the kitchen. But this strange paranormal situation got even stranger because her children were completely frozen in place. All her kids stood there as if they were frozen in time, but for some reason, she was able to move around freely. From her kitchen window, she could see 4 strange beings walking past her back porch and making their way through their kitchen door. Then these 4 beings phased right through the door like something out of a sci-fi movie. Quasga and the 3 shorter beings appeared to Betty and needed her to come to their planet. Betty took this very seriously and treated the angels with respect because she believed that these angels were angels in disguise. Betty couldn't be sure if she was in control of her own thoughts because at first, she tried to resist going with them. However, the aliens kept repeating themselves inside her head to come with them until she eventually felt compelled to do so. She followed Quasga and the 3 beings in a single file line as they levitated back to the UFO. Quasga kept reassuring Betty that no harm would come to her and that they are doing this to help the world. But the question is, why Betty? Quasga just repeated that no harm would come to her, and he gave her a strange blue book as they boarded the UFO. The inside of the UFO was sterile, which is the best way to describe it. Everything was sleek and smooth, with no visible doors or buttons. Everything just blended together. The first thing Betty noticed was that she was in a half-domed area. Quasga and the other entities were discussing what they should do with her. Quasga ordered the others that they should take Betty upstairs while he prepares himself. Quasga entered the left room, and the other three beings took Betty to the door on the right. They entered a spiral staircase that led upwards. As they walked, Betty noticed that some sphere-shaped objects had manifested like ripples out of a water from the wall. The spherical objects hovered around her, almost like if they were observing her. The beings guided her to a room and left her there, saying that she would be alright. They left her there paralyzed, only able to move her head, and I can imagine the agony of just laying there unable to move. Something like sleep paralysis, except with little green men just looking at you. A platform emerged from the wall under her feet, and the wall started to glow brightly, almost like they were taking a picture of her. However, it wasn't instant like a camera. It kept shining for a while. Then, after everything was said and done, they came and picked up Betty to take her to the next spot. They went to the center of the room, and a strange tube brought them down like an elevator. She was taken to a room illuminated by streaks of dazzling light. They brought her to a different platform that emerged from the ground. They guided her step onto the platform, and then a thin streak of light engulfed her body. As she stayed there, the light grew brighter and brighter, until she couldn't see herself anymore. It didn't hurt, it wasn't hot, it was just bright. Then it all just stopped. The alien motioned to Betty and told her to come with them. The aliens eventually brought her to a dome-like room with a table in the middle. It was obviously an examination room. They levitated her onto the bed-like structure. Betty started agonizing in her head, but the mind control didn't let her act in her free will. Then Quasga showed up and began talking to the other aliens. Betty wasn't sure this was Quasga. The only thing she knew is that one of them was taller than the others, so she assumed it was Quasga. Quasga bargained with Betty, telling her that she needs to be brave as they're going to purify her. Betty didn't know what that meant, but she tried to brace herself anyway. Then a strange wire came from the wall with a thin, long, silver-like needle at the end of it. Betty started to panic because she realized what was going to happen. That long, thin needle was going to go up her nose. Quasga noticed Betty's anxiety and calmed Betty down by placing her hand over her head, giving her a relaxing sensation. Quasga came over with a strange instrument and told her that he was going to check her for light because she was filled with it, but that they had to do a physical check on her because some parts were missing. He explained it was going to be alright and that no harm would come to her. The needle then extended and went up Betty's left nostril. She could hear a membrane break. Then another wire came from the wall, and this one was inserted straight into her belly button. To Betty, this felt like it lasted an eternity. The agony of a needle going into your nose and the wiggling of the tube in her belly button gave her a grotesque feeling of agonizing dread. But every time she panicked, Quasga was there to place his hand over her head and relax her. Betty explained that the alien had pulled out a silver marble from her nose to measure her light. The wire in her belly button was checking to see if her body could create, but they told her that it was missing. Betty mentions that they couldn't find her ability to create because she had it removed during surgery when she got cancer. However, according to her, she was considered purified and ready to set foot on their alien planet. But the question still remains, why do they need her light so bad? Well, the answer will shock you. For the most part, Betty's story is the same as most alien abductions, but what makes her special is that where most stories end here, Betty's keeps on going. Most of these aliens follow the catch and release policy where they abduct somebody and then do their experiments and release them out back into the wild. But Betty's story takes a huge turn because in her story, she actually meets the alien leader, and she eventually finds the meaning of all this light that's been going around. Well, at least Betty does. I can't really say the same for us. All I can really say is that the alien leader is very familiar to us. We just never expected him to be aliens. After Betty's purification, it was time for her to finally visit the alien world. They brought her to a cylinder room that had a row of chairs. It looked like these chairs were made out of some sort of material that looked like a mixture of plastic and glass. They sat her down on the chair. Then, as she was sitting there, a glass-like blanket surrounded her. The alien said that this would keep her safe, and as they said that, the glass blanket wrapped around her body almost like shrink wrap. Then 3 tubes came from the top of this glass-like chamber thing. These tubes were meant for each hole in Betty's face, one for each nostril and one for her mouth. After that, a strange gray-like substance started filling the chamber, and it felt like a whirlpool was turning inside the chamber. But Betty didn't say that this was unpleasant. She said it was more like a massage. And as the goo kept on filling the chamber, a syrup-like substance came down from the tube that went into her mouth. They fed her a strange syrup, and the best way she can describe it, it was a sweet syrup that melted all her worries away. As the chamber kept filling, she eventually lost consciousness. But when she woke up, she was met by 2 other aliens. But these aliens had a strange black veil over their face. They greeted Betty the way aliens greet humans, with an awkward silence. They then gestured to her and they started to glide across in what looked like to be a track that was 4 feet wide. This track led into a tunnel system that seemed like it could go for miles, but they eventually guided her into a strange mirror-like structure. And the easiest way to describe it is that it was a wall that reflected everything back, but as you touched it, it would ripple. Betty and the aliens eventually went through this mirror-like substance that could only be a portal, and she went into this world where everything was red. As they followed the track, she could see a strange structure that looked like black boxes, and as she got closer to these structures, she saw what looked like a humanoid creature crawling around the surface of these buildings.
And these beings got 2 eyeballs, and there are loads of them. Oh, they're scary. And they've skinny arms and legs and kind of a full body. And their eyes can move every which way, and they can climb just like monkeys. They can climb up quickly and swiftly and down and around and in and out of windows. They are all over the place.
Betty and the 2 aliens glided past through these lemur-like creatures, and she could see that the lemurs were staring right back at her as they passed by. They eventually got to another portal. They went through it and it took them to a world that was completely green. From here, it looked like the aliens that were guiding her were relieved to finally pass through the lemur-like creatures. They took off their black veils almost like a sign of relief. For some reason, she was getting the vibe that the lemurs were actually dangerous, and the only thing stopping them were those black veils. But they continued to their path onwards. The small path followed into the air, almost like a monorail, and it led them to a pyramid that she could see right below them. This pyramid was a little off because the pyramid was not a perfect triangle. It had a slight angle to it, and the top of the pyramid, there was a face that looked feminine. Betty described this head as being Egyptian, with 11 cheeks, but that it was a slender face, and not a fat face like the ones in the Sphinx. Off on the distance, she could see a fish-like school bus flying around. As she followed to the path, they eventually got to the crystal-like object. This crystal was shining a bright light that looked like it turned into a rainbow. But the light kept on getting brighter and hotter until eventually Betty could make out what was inside the light. It was a huge bird that was 15 feet tall. The bird was burning and on fire, and it gave off a light orange glow. And as the bird was burning, it left ashes from its body that trickled to the floor. From the ashes, a big fat worm was laying there, and from there, Betty could hear what sounded like many voices blending into one booming voice, and it talked to her.
You have seen and you have heard. Do you understand?
No, I don't understand what this is all about, why I'm even here.
I have chosen you.
For what have you chosen me?
I have chosen you to show the world.
Are you God? Are you the Lord God?
Fear not. Your own fear makes you feel these things. I would never harm you. It is your fear that you draw to your body that causes you to feel these things. I can release you, but you must release yourself of that fear through my son.
After the encounter with the eagle and the worm, she was sure that she was meeting God, And she didn't see this as a hallucination or an abduction. She saw this as a message from God himself. If you're probably hearing this, you're probably thinking to yourself that these are just delusions from a fanatical religious housewife. But that's actually not the case, because everything is pointing to the opposite of that. Now, the story itself is seen from the perspective of Betty, who is religious, and she's trying to find meaning in the story. So everything she looks at is going to be religious by nature. But one thing that the author of the book says is that the phoenix predates the birth of Jesus. And when the church was forming, one of the biggest things about Jesus was that the phoenix was used to represent him. And one of the most interesting parts about the story itself is how accurate the story of the phoenix was. I think most people know what a phoenix is. It's a burning bird that burns itself and turns itself to ash. But what most people don't really know is that the worm is also part of the story. And Betty was able to get this detail right. Now, it could be possible that Betty did some research beforehand about the early symbolisms in the Catholic Church, and maybe she knew that the phoenix was used to represent Jesus. But if that's the case, why would she add the pyramids to that part? I'm not sure how popular the idea that aliens built the pyramids back in the 1960s was, but I would imagine it was a pretty fringe idea at the time. And Betty was able to tie this idea into her story, which wasn't an easy thing to do, especially since the internet wasn't invented back then. Now, I'm not saying that it's impossible for her to know all these things, but something that the author also mentions is that her story lines up with a lot of the other alien abductions that weren't released to the public yet. But I think for me, the biggest thing that makes it all real is that she actually has some witnesses. And the biggest witness was Wino Aho, her dad. When the aliens brought her back to Earth, her family was still frozen in place, but for some reason, they unfroze Wino, and he saw the aliens bringing Betty back. The biggest thing about Wino is that he was very reluctant to give his side of the story, because he was just trying to forget everything. He eventually agreed to the hypnosis, but really didn't push through it. But that's not the only witness. In fact, her daughter Becky also saw these alien beings. For some reason, when they were initially frozen, Becky wasn't completely unconscious. Becky was still frozen in place, but she was still able to see what was going on. She wasn't able to move her hands or her body, but she was still able to see with her eyes. Kwasga noticed this and went to Becky and put his hands over her forehead, and this put her back into sleep. Now, the biggest thing for me about believing these stories is how the person took it. For Betty, she actually didn't make too much money from it. She sold the rights, but from what I can tell, she didn't make a lot of money. What did happen is that her life started to fall apart, which is kind of the big reason why she stopped doing these hypnosis regressions. And this eventually led to her divorcing James because their marriage fell apart. Oh yeah, and James also made a full recovery. But in the end, it didn't make her life better. In fact, it made her life worse telling the story. So I'll leave it to you to decide whether the story is true or not. But that's all I got for you guys. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.